Welcome to CiRCE 2015. We have Andrew Pudewa with us, and we're going to talk about classical education.
Great.
So what is your one or two sentence definition of a classical education?
One or two sentence. Well, I didn't make it up, but I can have my favorite, right?
Sure.
Which would be the great books and the liberal arts.
Okay.
The greatest ideas that have been thought and expressed in the best way through all of time, and then the tools of learning.
Tools of learning. Okay. Thank you. And I'm going to skip ahead to some of the great books because that just ties in nicely.
Okay.
Sure.
Sure.
And then I'll come back. So you mentioned that the definition of a classical education is the liberal arts, being the seven liberal arts.
Seven liberal arts.
Along with the great books and basically passing that down. What is, excluding the Bible, what is in your position, in your opinion, is the greatest book? The greatest great book?
That's just not a fair question. That's just like saying which of your children are your favorites. I mean, you can't honestly
So the answer
answer.
Involves how many there are?
But I think the greatest great book is the one I just read, whichever one that might be at any given moment in time. So
which was the last one?
Once I taught, the Iliad, I thought that was it, and then I taught the Odyssey, and I thought that was it, and then I read Anna Karenina at Martin's suggestion, and I said, that's the greatest book. And I just finished Till We Have Faces by C.S. Lewis, and I thought, wow, that's maybe the best book I've heard. So the best one is always the most recent one because it has the greatest impact on me at the time.
Okay.
But John Senior said there isn't a list. If you have heard of it, it's either a good or great book.
Okay.
I don't know if
so it
that's
goes
true or
into
not.
one of those two categories, good or great?
Well,
or I suppose bad.
He said you read the 1,000 good books, typical of what kids might read, Treasure Island,
Right.
Stuff like that, so that you can read the 100 great books.
The 100 great books.
Yeah.
Okay. And I guess among the 100 great books, if you had to, the desert island question.
Oh gosh! And it's
you
not
can
the
take
Bible.
Five. It's not the Bible. You can take five.
Well,
I'm going to push you on this.
The complete works of Shakespeare.
Okay, I'll give you that.
Which, by the way, was one of the two books that Lewis and Clark took on their expedition. Really? They took the King James Bible and the complete works of Shakespeare. And in memoirs, he wrote, and we did due diligence each day to both the Holy Writ and the Bard.
Oh, really? Okay. Yeah. So they had plenty of Shakespeare.
Yeah. Then, since I'm getting complete books, I'd probably go for the complete works of Plato.
Okay.
We're going to squeeze in as many as possible.
Well, there we go.
And I don't know, I might have to take Anna Karenina.
Okay.
The great thing about a great book is that you can read it again and again and again, and you get more out of it each time. And they're not all old. Right. There are books written by people still living today that I think I could read again and again and again. In fact, there's a fantastic book by Thomas Howard called Chance or the Dance.
Okay.
I've read that, just the first few pages of that book, I read half a dozen times before I went on because it was just so rich and such a beautiful experience.
Okay, well, I'll have to look that one up.
You will, yeah.
And so that's 4.
Oh, come on. I have to choose a 5th one, huh?
You've not mentioned Homer. Almost everyone mentions that one first.
Well, okay, I'll take...
You'll take Homer? Well, thanks.
I might need a dictionary to help me, though, since I'm on a desert island and my iPhone won't work.
Many of our viewers feel inadequate to teach classically. How would you respond to that feeling?
We are trying to recapture something that's been lost. And it's been lost for a long time, longer than you or I have been alive. We didn't grow up with it. We didn't know about it until late in life. Late I have come to thee, O classical education. And yet, like pioneers, we have to hack through the forest of of ignorance and miseducation to discover the hidden valley and the beautiful temple of what was before available to everyone. So we're going to experience some frustration and pains because we don't know the path. We have to look to those who are just ahead of us. And Chesterton, I believe, was the one who said anything doing is worth doing badly. Anything worth doing is worth doing badly.
Right.
And I'm totally convinced that this is worth doing. Teaching Latin, reading great books, polishing logic and rhetoric skills. And so while I am not masterful at it, I believe it's still worth trying to teach it, because then my children, my students, will get a head start. And they will be better educated than I am. And their children and their students will be better educated than they are. We will stand on the shoulders of those gone before us. And it's sometimes I feel kind of like Moses, not because of being holy or anything, but because he just got to look at the promised land, right? I will probably die before I become well educated. I don't have enough time left.
Right.
But my children will be farther down the line, and their children.
No children. So it's a multi-generational experience.
We have to think this way, I think,
Okay.
to recapture and rebuild the true tradition of real education of the soul with the cultivation of wisdom and virtue. It's a big project.
Okay.
It's going to take time.
Yeah. So we need to identify what's worth doing, and then do it even if we do it badly.
As best we can.
And then, so how do we identify what's worth doing? So you mentioned Latin. You know, how do we know? You know, how do we know who to listen to? How do we know what is worth doing?
Well, what's exciting is that now there's so many more resources than there were even 20 years ago. Right? There's Roman Roads Media. There's people like Wes Callahan and Martin Cawthorn, Andrew Kern. There's Chris Perrin, John Hodges. There's books that they've produced on how to do this and drawn from decades of experience. So now we can read those books, we can compare notes, we can get together at conventions like CiRCE, we can talk and learn from one another, and then we can go back into the field of our homes and our classrooms and try to apply those ideas and then just keep doing it year after year, and trust that the Lord will bless our efforts, even though we are painfully imperfect.
Okay. And to someone who is treading along doing that, but they feel like it's just such a slow process, you know, do you have any words for that person who feels like they've taken just a little step and they want to be going faster?
Well, I think there's power in community. I think that's why we've seen groups like Classical Conversations
So find others.
grow and be so successful, because they have a shared vision, and they can divide and conquer in a way. You know, you teach these kids, I'll teach these, we'll get together and figure out how to do this better. A lot of classical co-ops. Yeah, if you're trying to do this all alone in a homeschool, that's really tough. If you have a group of people that you're on the journey with, it's going to be easier. And then we can kind of get virtual friends by bringing them into our homes through video, which is a powerful medium, as you and I have both discovered.
I agree. Yeah. So what is the first step or change someone should take to begin teaching classically if they weren't previously doing teaching classically?
Well, probably read a book on classical education. I mean, there's several to choose from.
Okay. What's one that you would recommend?
The liberal arts tradition, I think, is a good one. And I know...
Who's that by, the liberal arts tradition?
Oh, that was Classical Academic Press. And then Andrew Kern just published one. Kern just wrote, didn't he? Someone just wrote one. I don't know. Don't ask me that question.
I heard about it. Okay.
I don't know the books.
Cut.
But there are several to choose from.
Right.
And maybe what you could do is put some titles or links onto this video, you know, at the end or in between.
I know there's a bunch out there. There's tables full of them. So.
Yeah, and put some, put a bibliography on the screen for people.
Right.
And that way they can see the several that I can't
Okay, yeah.
remember and name by name.
Yeah.
But let's take this question in a slightly different direction. In addition to reading about classical education, I think probably one of the most important things to do is start with yourself as a
Okay.
parent, as a teacher. Start by choosing a book that you believe would enrich your mind and soul, and read it. Get some help. There's all sorts of commentary and YouTubes and Roman road media that would help. And read a great book for yourself first before you try to do it or teach it or do anything, right? If you start with yourself, then it comes out of you to your students. If you
Okay.
try to grab the thing and throw it at your students, then there's a lack of confidence and ownership, and there'll be a superficiality that'll be frustrating to everyone. So start
Okay.
with yourself, right? There's a little
Right.
bit of summer remaining.
Sure, yeah.
So get a
Good for the
great
summer.
book, read it, wrestle with it a little bit, try to find someone you can read it with, your spouse, a friend, and talk about it. I think that's the first step on the pathway, really.
Would you say that the goal is to learn to love something and choose something worthy of loving, so that if it and that would lead to then being able to acquire that yourself and then teach it?
Absolutely.
Oh.
If you are diligent, you will bring something into yourself. You will then love it, and then
Right.
you'll be able to share it. Interesting little word study I just learned is that the word diligent is derived from diligo, diligere, which is the Latin verb to love. It's one of
Okay.
several, but it means to
So
love.
to be diligent brings love, and
Exactly.
those who love something will communicate that.
Well,
So that's how to educate our kids.
and the teaching then becomes, to quote another person, I didn't think of this, but I experienced it, the overflow from the teacher, the soul of the teacher, to the soul and mind of the student.
Okay. Well, thank you.
Sure.
If you could go to dinner with any three educators, who would they be?
Well, I already go to dinner with the living people that I like to be with, but if I could choose some not living people,
Okay. Yeah.
I think I would love to meet and talk with George Wythe, who was the teacher of Thomas Jefferson.
Okay.
Thomas Jefferson would be my first choice, but I don't know if we would consider him an educator per se, although he did found the University of Virginia. So
I think that counts as an
Wythe
educator.
and/or Jefferson,
Okay.
or Wythe, I think sometimes his name is pronounced Wythe. Mortimer Adler, I think, would be just a fascinating person to meet. And since I don't speak Greek, I wouldn't choose Homer or somebody like that, Plato. I would choose an English-speaking person, probably C.S. Lewis.
C.S. Lewis.
Yeah, Lewis
I would enjoy that.
and Adler and George Wythe. Who knows? Maybe they're all sitting around talking together as we speak. We can join the conversation someday.
Well, there we go. Actually, I'd like to ask another question
Sure.
too. Homeschoolers often have trouble writing. They've not been taught the essentials of writing, and that's often the part when they come to papers that is difficult for them, for parents to teach, and for especially high schoolers to do. Where would you point them? I know that you are Institute for Excellence in Writing is something you founded or
Yes, yeah,
involved. So that's
my
obviously
company.
a resource on, and what would be your encouragement for them, and where would be the first resource that you would recommend to begin learning to be better writers?
Well, that's a huge question. I could talk on hours, but let me try to put it down into the two simplest ideas that I
Okay.
can. The first is input, language input. You can't get out of a brain something that isn't in there to begin with. So if you want a child to be able to produce reliably correct and sophisticated language, spoken or written, you have to feed that mind with a great source, great database. You build this mansion of reliably correct and sophisticated English. And do
Okay.
that in two primary ways. One, reading out loud to children in huge quantity, high quality literature. And number two, memorizing good literature. Primarily with children, poetry, scripture by extension, as they get older, excerpts from famous speeches. So when you hear, and it's more powerful than reading because it builds into the mind the syntax in a more complete, constructed, nuanced way. You build that database of language when you hear the language, and then you move things from a passive to an active vocabulary when you memorize and recite them. So a large repertoire of memorized language will do, as we think in the canons of rhetoric, memory will furnish the mind with the words, the syntax, the patterns, the ideas, and the beauty that will then allow them to be good writers. In fact, that is the number one predictor of good writing skills in adults, is having been read to out loud in huge quantity as a child. Then on the output side, how do we begin? The problem with the way writing has been taught in this country for close to 40 years now is that it's all kind of free. It's creative writing, it's self-expression, it's, be unique, make something up. And we've abandoned, with this modern, worship of self-expression, the actual tools that allow people to do that well. So we have an irony in stressing creativity in the elementary and middle grades. We've actually wiped out the basic skills that make creativity possible. So a lot of children, especially if you start homeschooling your kids in public school or a couple of years, they may have a concept of writing that is just do whatever you want. So where do we begin? Well, with imitation. That's the classical approach. So in the simplest form, imitation would be copying. Just find a beautiful fairy tale, copy it, copy scripture, copy poetry, copy anything. If it's half decent information, if it's half decent English language going into your brain and being then transferred onto paper, you're accomplishing a whole lot of things. You're modeling correct mechanics, punctuation, spelling. You're modeling correct sentence structure. You're reading it 3 or 4 times, and you're building the physical stamina of putting words on paper. So we've discounted the value of copy work as a way to learn to write. If you go back 150 years ago, that's all they did for about 3 years. Right? Nobody would have wasted paper on a 9-year-old so they could make up their own story. They would copy. And then one step removed from that is really where our syllabus begins. And that is using a source text as a model, making what we call a keyword outline. By not copying the whole thing, copying a few words from each sentence or each idea, removing the original, and then trying to reconstruct that text, both verbally and then in writing. This process is actually explained by Benjamin Franklin in his autobiography, where he said that I became aware of my shortcomings in writing and determined to endeavor at improvement, and so I found a volume of The Spectator. I thought the writing good and wished to imitate it, so I took short hints of the sentiment in each sentence, laid the original by a few days, and then tried to express those sentiments in those hinted sentiments as fully as I could. So Franklin knew...
And then comparing again with the original?
Yeah. And he points out in the autobiography, sometimes I discovered my version was actually better than the original. I had, gotten lucky. And
you could see progress?
Yeah,
or perhaps over time?
But the thing about learning a skill, and this is true whether it's a sport or music or dance or anything you're trying to learn, if you just do what you can do and you continue to do only what you can do, you will still be able to do what you can do, but you will not be able to do anything you cannot do because you'll be limited because you're just doing what you can do. You follow that?
I think so.
However, if you have a model, something higher, something better than yourself, something to imitate, something to strive for, whether it's a master teacher demonstrating or a text that is well done and you're trying to imitate that, this will allow you to do something that you couldn't do only on your own. So we kind of cap out at our own level of competence.
Right.
But if we search out and find that which will allow us to imitate up and model up, then we can grow and improve.
Okay. And would you go ahead and keep upping that, start with very simple text then for beginners, and then keep bringing in more complex, more eloquent?
Generally, that's what we do, both as we work through the syllabus of our units and our structural models and stylistic techniques, and as students get older, then the source texts are going to become more complicated. Now, I gave you just the tip of our iceberg, just the first few steps in our process, similar to that Franklin's idea. But then we have 9 units that go through story sequence and understanding the structure of stories, paragraph structure, writing from pictures to be able to ask questions and describe events, a research process, a creative writing or inventive writing unit, and then we have formal essays, academic style essays and critiques. So it goes all the way through, and then we've got materials to help people gear that at different levels. So primary, middle, upper.
Okay.
Yeah.
Yeah, different levels. You mentioned 2 elements of the learning that have been affected by technology. One is reading to your children, and the other is copy. With reading, I thought about the audiobooks and their wide availability, and so and then with copying, there's the art of handwriting has just been. I see people asking the question, I even teach my children handwriting?
Yes.
So typing. So are audiobooks a substitute in your mind, partial substitute or substitute?
Audiobooks are fantastic because they can redeem the time, right? Driving in a car, doing your chores. You can be listening to good literature.
Right.
They are, I would say, second best to a real person reading, because if I'm reading to children and I see a word that may be unfamiliar to them, or an idiom, or an allusion to something else in history or literature, I can stop and we can define that or explain it, have a conversation about it. That's what pulls up comprehension.
Okay.
Right? That's what creates better understanding.
So it has its use, but more limited because of the non-human.
Yeah, but it would still be way better than nothing. Or bad music, which is what people listen to way too much at the time.
Right.
But yes, so audiobooks, I'm all in favor. And I have a very dyslexic son. He didn't read a book. He didn't read anything until he was 11 years old. He didn't read a book till he was 12. But he had listened to hundreds of books in the first 6 years, from when he was around 5 or 6 to when he finally learned to read books. He had listened to more books than the average person has read in their whole life. So he got a database of language that actually, when he started to write, after overcoming the dyslexia to some degree, he started to write. He writes eloquently and complex, sophisticated. In a way, he's almost more literate than, his siblings, who all read, at various times, but younger than he did.
Right.
So there's almost a slight advantage in that he never read drivel. He never read junk. He only listened to good and great books. In terms of the handwriting, this is a big subject in schools too. Yes. And the new Common Core curriculum thing doesn't even mention paper or anything. It's all conceptual. Right. So how do you define writing? But I did a little research and actually did a talk at a conference last year called Pen and Paper, What the Research Says. Okay. And evidently, when you write on paper, you're using a lot more of your brain than when typing. It's activating brain cells that don't get activated when you're punching keys. That's a good thing. Yeah. One step further, when you write in cursive, you're using more and a different part of your brain than when you're printing. So by using cursive, you actually access some of the artistic or maybe intuitive areas of the brain. Neurons are firing, as opposed to printing, and both are better in terms of brain use when typing. I also think from an artistic point of view, it's real easy these days to just start typing and then you read and go, oh, that's not good, and you change it, right? And we have this attitude like, it's so easy to change anything, I don't have to be too careful. Right. But, think about Mark Twain writing, on paper, or C.S. Lewis wrote all of his things with fountain pen on paper, right? Or Jefferson, wrestling over his letters or the Declaration. You would form a sentence in your mind. You would repeat it, you would rehearse it, you would tweak it, you would perfect it, and then you would commit it to paper. So I think in terms of thoughtfulness, writing on paper has kind of an interesting advantage. And I believe that by losing the writing on paper, particularly in the formative years of growing up, we may be giving, we may be shortchanging the thinking skills that are associated with that.
I see. So you would consider handwriting a part of learning to write, the art of handwriting?
For most people. Obviously, there's going to be a few that have such an extreme dysgraphia or a physical disability that would disallow that. And so we accommodate that with technology, and that's wonderful.
Right.
But I think if we eliminate handwriting from the curriculum, the damage that is done, by the time we realize it, it will be too late to fix it.
Okay.
And then,
on the large scale especially,
on the large
we're going to start
social
seeing
scale.
the effect.
Yeah.
Okay.
In fact, it's interesting, by wiping out cursive from the curriculum, we're now regularly graduating school teachers who can't read cursive writing themselves, right?
And that includes a lot of founding documents and...
Oh, sure. Yeah, you couldn't read the Declaration of the Original. And I went
apparently
to the...
there's doctors, too, who...
well, there's a reason for
issue,
that.
yeah.
But I went to the Civil War Museum in Richmond
Yes.
recently, and they have things that were written by the officers and soldiers kind of in a display case. And not only is their handwriting beautiful, their language is eloquent. And so, some of these were men with, minimal formal education, maybe 8th grade, whatever, and yet their prose was just beautiful. So, why? Well, no technology to interfere.
Right.
Hearing stories growing up, being read to out loud, and then just that discipline of writing on paper, and mastering it so that it was, nobody had sloppy handwriting back then. Why? Because they did it until it wasn't sloppy.
Right.
Yeah.
I remember reading a Childhood of a Famous American series, and I think it was Paul Revere telling about how, he would get in big trouble if he didn't perfectly copy a sentence. And that was school, copying sentences. That reminded me of what you were saying about copying.
Kipling wrote a fantastic poem. I would commend to anyone to just go look this poem up and learn it, memorize it. It's tremendously prescient. And it's called The Gods of the Copybook Headings.
Okay.
And of course, the students were copying wisdom, right? Proverbs, sections of fables, sayings that were timeless truths.
Right.
Right? So they would get it into their heart and brain even more powerfully by copying it again and again and again. And then in this poem, he points out that these timeless truths will outlast the progressive ideas. And of course, Kipling lived a long time ago, so the progressive ideas have progressed even more downhill since then.
Sure. So we need to keep copying.
Yeah.
Well, thank you very much.
Pleasure.
Thanks. Well, appreciate it.